G'day folks, today I want to kind of revisit the tale of office computers turning into sleeper gaming rigs. Now what I have today is this, which I got in a recent haul, but nothing too recent of course. This is an Acer Veriton M2630G computer, probably from around, if I remember the manufacturer date on the side correctly, which I don't. It is built sometime around the 6th of May 2014. So this is a fairly dated computer by today's standards, but it's still actually got a little bit of capability under the hood. And in this case, since I put in a graphics card, it's actually surprising at what this thing can do. And a memory upgrade, of course, because that's pretty flippin' obvious. Two of the most obvious remarks about why this computer was more than likely the most unremarkable thing in the world was mainly the RAM. It had 4 gigabytes of RAM. But then, of course, as I just showed, the Intel Core i3 case badge. This has a Core i3-4130 CPU, and it's nothing fancy or anything that's going to be special in the near future. This is a dual-core, hyper-threaded CPU, and it shows, basically. It's still pretty capable for doing everyday office computing tasks like web browsing and document editing, presentations. Heck, even a little bit of more advanced stuff could probably be done with a computer such as this if you knew how to implement it. But otherwise, this thing just had its Intel HD graphics integrated into the system that it would use for its video, and just a 500 gig hard drive. So absolutely nothing fancy in this computer. In fact, it's so bare bones in this regard that, you know, for a machine this new, there's absolutely no USB 3.0 hardware of any kind on this computer. Literally every port that you see, be it these 2s and these 4 2s back here, none of them support USB 3. It's kind of impressive, but I guess it is what it is. So anyways, I'm kind of droning on it long enough because, well, let's just face it. I mean, the results are probably not too exciting, but it's still interesting to take a look at nonetheless. So without further ado, I guess we'll just hop right into the numbers of this system with a graphics card, which, by the way, for a graphics card is a Radeon R9 270 2 gig GDDR5. It uses a single fan cooler, runs on one 6-pin connector, and I had 16 gigs of 1333 megahertz. I think it was either 1333 or 1600 megahertz DDR3. I'll verify that and I'll have it in a little subtitle up here. But anyways, on with the results. So first up, we have an early access Steam title, Golf with Your Friends, and this is tested with the Worms map, the most intensive inbuilt map in the game. And this used 1080p at low because I figured I'm going to keep the resolution at the native resolution of my monitor for as many of these tests as I possibly can. And this game actually fared surprisingly well, better than I thought, with an average FPS of 98. Now, I will say, special effects like that bomb effect that you just saw do tend to make this thing stutter due to the lighting. So definitely you can tell with the 1% and 0.1% lows of the benchmark results you see on screen, definitely were not exactly that pretty. So definitely the CPU is holding back the graphics card in this case just a little bit. Either that or this game still needs some optimization, which I can't say I blame it because, again, early access Steam title. But overall, I'd say this game fared fairly well for how it is and the hardware that it was working with. So on to the next title. Warframe is up next, again at 1080p with everything set to low, or at least the low preset, except for medium textures. And as you can see, based on the frame rate figure on your screen, it's actually performing very well. And I thought there was going to be a VRAM concern, so that's why in this particular instance I had the VRAM gauge up with MSI Afterburner. But otherwise, this game fared really well with this hardware, having an average frame rate of 148 throughout this level, which was fairly intensive as far as the enemies and the guns were concerned, so this was a fairly good choice. Of course, Warframe has a lot of action going on, a lot of effects, and this can get fairly intensive with the settings turned up. So seeing an average of 148 with the low preset and medium textures is nothing to write home about, especially considering the fact of the hardware we're working with, but still, this is absolutely playable if you wanted to play in a competitive fashion, or at least with this game. I suppose the CPU has just enough give to where you can probably install a faster GPU, such as a GTX 1650 Super, and you might be able to get away with it. However, I don't really know. I think the CPU might start to become the bottleneck in that kind of instance, especially considering the 1% and 0.1% lows of 64.5 and even 0.7 frames per second respectively. I think those were due to the loading screens. I wouldn't say that that overall affects the gameplay negatively, you know, because loading screens are loading screens. I think throughout some of them, I think I was getting like 24 frames per second, so something to keep in mind. But it's nothing that's going to detract from the overall gameplay. Once you're actually in a level, it plays very well, and it holds its own. So Warframe is definitely a pass with the Acer Veriton M2630G. Next up is the obligatory Grand Theft Auto 5, a game that is getting a bit long in the tooth, but is still very much played by a lot of people these days. But before we get into the benchmark results, I just wanted to share this fail with you all. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the numbers. Now, the benchmark tests were actually fairly surprising given the settings. I used a mixture of normal and high, mainly high at 1080p, and with VSync off, and any form of MSAA turned off. And with the benchmark, I got an average of 84.6 FPS. It was definitely stuttery with the lighting changes. And in that benchmark, I saw some 1% and 0.1% lows of 26 and 19 respectively. Again, nothing that really detracts from the gameplay because it doesn't last very long. Just something to keep in mind. This is definitely a CPU-related bottleneck in this instance. However, benchmark results don't tell the whole story. And definitely once you get into the game itself, it definitely becomes more conclusive as to how you're actually going to see the results of this gameplay. Again, I kept the same settings that I talked about before with the benchmark, but this is just playing offline, and the average was significantly lower at 48 FPS. Now, with that having been said, the 1% and 0.1% lows were within margin of error, minus maybe a little bit of notable difference with the 1% lows. But again, the game stays consistent and composed throughout, only really hovering between the high 30s to the low 40s when you're driving quickly, and sometimes it can dip into the high 20s if a lot is going on. This is due to that weak CPU causing bottlenecks to the graphics card, which obviously you probably wouldn't want to play GTA 5 on a dual-core processor anyway. This is kind of cheating because it's hyper-threaded, but still, you definitely don't want to play this for long periods of time on a dual-core CPU such as this. But in a pinch, I guess it does work. It is not unplayable, but just something to keep in mind. It is definitely a little bit on the stuttery side, but it works pretty well otherwise. Here you have an older title, Dirt Rally 1. I don't have Dirt Rally 2, so sorry. Anyways, testing with the high preset and VSync off, I got an average frame rate of 71 with a 1% low and 0.1% low set of figures that look pretty good. However, I would say you can get better frame rates if you go down to medium. You get an average of 93. So I guess it's up to you whether you want quality or frame rate. Either way, this game ran very, very well with this hardware setup, as many Codemasters games do. So moving on. Okay, so here's a little bit of a curveball. Here's Beamng Drive, another Steam Early Access title, which has been in Early Access since 2013, although not necessarily exclusively on Steam. It had its own inbuilt thing for a bit before moving to Steam. But I digress. Anyway, there's no, benchmark to run with this game, so I thought I'd try something that's fairly simple and would be fairly consistent. So we're on the Italy map, which is the largest map in the game that's built in, and we're using probably one of the fanciest cars in the game, the ETK 800 series, specifically the 856 TT Sport Plus. And I figured this would be a decent benchmark because all this stuff is built into the game. It can all be readily done, so it keeps things consistent as far as testing is concerned. Now, for this, I did average 60 frames per second, give or take, at the low preset at 1080p with anti-aliasing turned off and bloom turned on. Now, this isn't anything to write home about because, of course, Beamng Drive relies more on the CPU than the GPU. It does tend to stutter with this dual-core CPU very badly, so do keep that in mind. Optimal performance on a quad-core is not a joke when it comes to Beamng Drive. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to Beamng Drive is that there's no consistency when it comes to the frame rate due to the early access nature of the title. the CPU intensive nature of it, and because things can vary very widely between map to map, vehicle to vehicle, scenario to scenario. You just never know. Beamng tends to be very unpredictable as far as its results are concerned. So something like what you just saw can be very demanding on the CPU, not necessarily the graphics card, because you can see the frame rates are staying consistently decent and playable, but you can tell the high CPU usage is definitely something that you need to watch out for. Otherwise, Beamng Drive was a fairly positive experience with this computer. Now, I wouldn't go out of my way to play it, because definitely if you have a more intensive mod that has a lot of parts, like a vehicle mod or a very large and RAM-intensive map that might have a lot of flora, it will definitely, without a doubt, trip this thing up without any issues. And that's kind of the thing when it comes to Beamng, is that lack of optimization, but we'll cut it some slack because it's early access, and it's going to be early access for many years to come, because it's a lot of hard work to get a game like this perfected. So with that having been said, I will say for now it runs really well, but I wouldn't go out of my way to say that this is your primary Beamng machine. I would get something with a big CPU for sure. Now it's time for the most intensive titles. This one that you see in front of you is Watchdogs 2, and it definitely fared the worst in this case because I had to drop the resolution from 1080p to 1600 by 900. Now, not to say that this game looks horrible, but it definitely does show that it's on the low preset, no doubt in my mind. Now, this game actually ran a lot better than I was expecting to. Again, take note of that very high CPU usage compared to the GPU. This game is actually a little more optimized than I thought, and it actually fared surprisingly well, or at least compared to maybe even Grand Theft Auto 5 due to the open world nature of the game. But again, I still stuck to the low preset because I didn't want to take any chances with anything bottlenecking or running like crap or stuttering, and the results that you see on screen are actually surprising, at least given this game. So again, take it for what you will. This would probably vary depending on the scenario. I just tested briefly because, you know, I didn't want to go on too long with testing. And finally we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a game that I thought was going to run like absolute trash because of the fact I'm using an AMD graphics card. Actually fared a lot better than I thought. Now, this was taken with the low preset at 1080p, and surprisingly the average was 43 FPS. I was very surprised by this. Now, the reason why the 1% and 0.1% lows are the same is because that was from the loading screen. Now, the loading screens can drop the frame rate for some reason. I don't know why they do, but they do. So those are completely inaccurate. Most of the time, you'd see the frame rate hover around the low to mid 30s because the visuals of this game are actually surprisingly beautiful, and they can be taxing on the graphics card depending on where you're looking. Now, I also want to show something that I found during benchmarking, which was very weird. I'm not sure why this is in here, but I think it's due to the graphical preset. Either that or it was some bug. But if you take a look at the scene as it's coming in, you can tell the frame rate's fairly high, and then all of a sudden, like, what? So, definitely not sure what was up with that, but either way, there you go. That's Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Definitely playable, but just stuff to keep in mind. So, anyways. So in conclusion, what do I think about the Acer Veriton M2630G when you add it graphics card and 16 gigs of RAM? Well, I will say that it is a fairly decent gamer for what it is, which is just your basic, boring office computer with a graphics card in it, similarly to that of a Dell Optiplex that you throw a graphics card into. So obviously, nothing is too out of the ordinary. You are going to get better frame rates with a graphics card. That's pretty obligatory. But I probably would say that it's starting to show its last signs of having decent playable performance with AAA titles. And I don't know if that's strictly due to the CPU or the graphics card or a combination of the both. But I will say that, especially with like Watchdogs 2, with the drop in resolution, that is something definitely to keep in mind, because with 1080p, it was sharply dropping into the 30s and low 20s, and it was just stuttery. But 1600 by 900 seemed to clean it up for some reason. I don't know what the deal was, but you know, it just seemed to run a lot better with the lowered resolution. So maybe that's just a bottleneck with the CPU. It just couldn't keep up. And that's certainly something that's going to haunt this computer without a CPU upgrade for probably the next few years until it just becomes completely unplayable. But overall, I was very impressed by the results with this computer. Definitely, it's not out of the question that you still, can or cannot game on a Core i3 like this, or at least any kind of major dual-core CPU these days with AAA titles. But this one seemed to do okay with the indie titles, the AAA titles, so on and so forth. But definitely, both the CPU and the GPU could benefit from a bit of an upgrade. Like this could go to a quad-core i5 CPU with no issues, like a 4670, and it'd probably do okay. And maybe the GPU could be upgraded, like I mentioned in the Warframe benchmark, to a 1650 Super, and maybe it might be a decent little gamer for a little while longer, but I don't know. It just depends on the chipset limitations, because this system uses an H81 chipset, so I couldn't tell you for sure what the exact CPU support list is, but you could definitely put some more money into this thing and still have a decent gamer for at least a couple more years to go. So, very impressive results, but obviously, I wouldn't go out of my way to buy one of these things. They're probably not really all that interesting or worth it. So with that having been said, I'm going to get out of here. So I appreciate you all coming to watch, and I will see you all in the next video.